South and North Korea are technically still at war, even though the fighting ended 6 decades ago. But that could all change very soon. It's South Korea's outgoing president, Moon Jae-in, who's leading the call to officially end the conflict. He wants a peace agreement on the Korean peninsula before his time is up in 2022. First, let's take a look at why the two Koreas are still at war. As the Korean War ground to a halt in 1953, South Korean leaders opposed the idea of a truce that left the peninsula divided. They refused to sign the armistice with military commanders from the North, the UN, and China, so the war was simply put on hold. In 2018, the idea of ending the war resurfaced most strongly when U.S. President Donald Trump, North Korean leader Kim Jong-un, and South Korea's Moon came together in a flurry of diplomacy. The two Koreas agreed to declare the war over by the end of that year.
I've been told that Kim Jong-un would like to meet.
And Trump said he'd give the effort his blessing if North Korea agreed to give up its nuclear weapons. But as disagreements over sanctions on Pyongyang and its nuclear weapons dragged on, the talks hit a wall, and so did any discussion of ending the war. So what could potentially change the situation now? Reuters correspondent Josh Smith says the war on hold is seen as a key source of conflict by Moon and others.
This is kind of seen, the war and the division of the peninsula as kind of the original sin that's left, tensions high between North Korea and then South Korea and the United States. And so it's seen as a possible first step towards reducing some of those tensions.
In a speech to the United Nations in September, Moon once again raised the idea. South Korea is calling first for a political declaration that the Korean War is over, then a peace treaty that replaces the armistice, and finally the establishment of a broader peace regime.
Basically, where there's a lot of disagreements over things like nuclear weapons or the sanctions that were imposed because of North Korea's nuclear weapons, South Korea sees perhaps a little bit more agreement on, simply all sides saying, let's acknowledge reality. We're not fighting a literal war right now.
But what would actually change on the Korean peninsula in the case of a peace agreement? North Korean officials have responded to Moon's proposals with interest, but they've called them premature without changing what it claims to be hostile policy and double standards over denuclearization. Meanwhile, some analysts in the United States say that while a peace agreement is certainly possible, it can only be made after North Korea agrees to denuclearization.
Eventually, the idea of a peace treaty is that, according to, folks in South Korea, is that eventually that might, really drastically change some of the military stance here. There might be a reduction in troops, in theory, on all sides. Under the most optimistic scenarios that the South Korean President Moon Jae-in has talked about, that could potentially include things like a rail line that goes from South Korea all the way to Europe. It could finally connect through North Korea, into Russia and across kind of thing.
Critics of Moon's proposals also worry that arriving at a peace agreement too soon could undermine U.S. deterrence in the region and potentially embolden North Korea militarily. American officials say they have discussed the potential end of war with their South Korean counterparts, but have not yet committed to a declaration.